Hello, I'm Father Gregory Pine. This is Pints with Aquinas, and in this video we're going to talk about the wounds of Christ, which are strange because wounds are a bad thing, and yet the Lord seems to, include them in one of the greatest things ever done. So it seems like he did so with a purpose in mind. Let's get after it. Okay, so the question comes from a patron named Mike Muir Jr., and he asks this. One major discrepancy I've always had trouble with is Jesus showing the disciples and Thomas the wounds in his hands and side. It has been taught to me, potentially in error, that Jesus was resurrected in roughly his perfect 18-year-old heavenly body, hence why Mary, his closest companion, mistook him for the gardener. If that is the case, why would he rise in an unblemished body but still have crucifixion wounds? Okay, so a couple of things from the start, and then some more things, and then some other things. So wounds have a way by which of kind of distinguishing somebody on account of the fact that wounds are suffered, and they're suffered in a way that's very personal. I remember I worked for the Thomistic Institute for 2 years, and the Thomistic Institute began working on this project called Aquinas 101, which if you haven't seen it, you should. It's awesome. And I recorded a couple of videos talking about some things that St. Thomas Aquinas taught. And I remember I chose to go through all the comments and respond to them. So if people had questions, I'd be like, hey, here's an answer, thus and such, and yada, yada. I mean, it was more profound than that, I hope. But I just remember getting one comment. I was like, what's wrong with your head? Savage. In answer to which, I was like, well, 8 years ago, I was playing soccer against another seminary, and I went head-to-head with another dude, and apparently his head was stronger than mine. And so here I am, just 3 surgeries later with a divot in my forehead. Life is difficult, but we keep going. Okay, so specifically with respect to the Lord, the question might be then, why does he, it's not as if he suffered some like soccer injury. Obviously, the suffering that he endured are of far greater significance. And yet still, you might think it would be in his plan to kind of blot those wounds out so as to show us that, in heaven, he'll wipe away every tear from our eyes, and there'll be no more death and mourning, and that this is a way by which of consoling us who, in this vale of tears, experience life as exceedingly difficult indeed. And there's, some good theological reasons to think that. So when St. Thomas Aquinas reads the resurrection accounts of the Lord, he kind of takes stock in a classic medieval fashion of different notes or different marks of the glorified body. And he says, there's a kind of integrity, there's a kind of subtlety, a kind of agility, a kind of clarity, a kind of impassibility, right? So he's looking at, Christ is like passing through walls or entering into unmarked rooms, or he's disappearing in the immediate company of Cleopas and the unnamed companion of his on the road to Emmaus. So there's like all of these things which are distinctive of the resurrected body that St. Thomas is trying to account for. And all of those entail a great perfection. So there's continuity, but there's perfection. You make mention here in the question of like an 18-year-old body. I think St. Thomas goes or inclines more for one's 33-year-old body because he thinks that represents the kind of perfection of corporeal form. So you would have attained to the fullness of not necessarily your intellectual capacity because there are still things to know or thinking to be refined, but certainly your body. And in that regard, he thought that one's resurrected body would be of that age. So then, okay, why the wounds? What's the deal with the wounds? And in answering the question, I think it's helpful just to return to the purpose or to return to the design of the incarnation in general. When you ask, like, why did take... That's not a sentence. Why did the Lord take human flesh in the first place? When St. Thomas asks that question, he says, let's refer to the sacred scriptures and take our cue from what they say. And wherever we turn in the sacred scriptures, when it gives an account for the incarnation, it says, basically, the Lord took human flesh to save us from our sin. Now, mind you, did he accomplish other ends in the incarnation? Right, like increasing our faith, our hope, our charity, divinizing us, giving us an example, etc. Yeah, absolutely. All those things are true. And that's a lively debate between Dominicans and Franciscans in the 13th century. But at root, or kind of at base, the Lord comes in order to save us from our sin. So then, okay, extend the logic of that. The Lord assumes everything proper to our human nature. So he assumes a human intellect, a human will, human passions. But he goes beyond that and even assumes the defects associated with our nature, which we incur because of sin. So the Lord suffers hunger and thirst and fatigue and ultimately even death, which are punishments. So that's to go above and beyond, as it were, like a kind of ordinary assumption of human nature. Mind you, he doesn't assume sin or ignorance because those would be at cross purposes with his plan of salvation. But he assumes, practically everything else. So then, when asking this particular question, why the wounds? I think it's helpful to see it as part of this logic of all of the things that Christ took to himself, a kind of, as it were, expression of his solidarity. And by rising from the grave with his wounds, it signals to us that his solidarity with our human state extends even beyond the grave. Now, there are a lot more reasons that you could kind of add in addition. But that would, I think, be a kind of basic or a kind of fundamental way by which to account for the continuity of the Lord's wounds before and after his resurrection. Maybe just to add a few more things beside. I think it helps us to establish identity. So like the questioner, like Mike Muir noticed, Mary has difficulty recognizing him. Cleopas has difficulty recognizing him. So there's something about the glorified body which is different, which makes it harder to recognize one. Or maybe those people were just overcome with grief and still thinking about the loss of our Lord Jesus Christ, and so ill-disposed to recognize him at his coming. But the wounds give you a kind of hold, and we see that especially in the story with Thomas, who says that he won't believe until such time as he puts his hands or his fingers into the Lord's side, into the Lord's hands, respectively. So the solidarity also, kind of gives expression to his identity, that he is God for us, that he is Emmanuel, that he is God with us. And here you can draw a helpful comparison with, or draw a kind of helpful similarity in illuminating this by talking about the martyrs. So when we picture the martyrs in their iconography, you often see the engines of their torture, which seems strange. But, even macabre or moribund, moribund's the wrong word. Macabre, that's the word I was looking for. Yep. It seems gross. Like, why would you exalt something that's an engine of torture that ultimately deals death? Well, in a kind of ironic reversal in the Christian life, we're able to take the very things which devastate us, which destroy us, which undo us, and then reverse their very logic. So we're able to make them instruments unto glory rather than instruments unto, death. And so St. Paul is pictured with a sword because it's with a sword that he was beheaded, and St. Andrew is pictured with an X-shaped cross for the same reason. And so too, the Lord bears the very marks in his body of his crucifixion. Obviously, he's pictured on the cross, and we worship the Lord on the cross. But he so deep is his identification that he bears the very wounds in his body. And I also think, and this will be the last point, and then I will stop talking, is that it repurposes for us, or it redefines for us what it means to be perfect as human beings. So to be perfect isn't to be free from any limitation whatsoever, as if we were supposed to live our lives in such a way as to kind of hold off at arm's length any burdensome responsibility or anything which might potentially age us or cause our hair to fall out or our teeth to yellow or our kind of gut to churn from anxiety. It's like, no, the point isn't to stay pristine in your corporeal form. The point is to tread well the pilgrimage of human life and to arrive at the end as one marked by the experiences that he or she had, which experiences, although they may entail great suffering, great trial, great difficulty, will ultimately redound to glory, provided that they are done in the Lord. And the Lord shows that in his very flesh, like the Passion, which is the most, terrible events ever to have transpired, an event in which humanity actually killed its God. Christ says even this, right, can be transformed unto the praise of God's glory, and that in manifest and most excellent fashion. And so too of our sufferings, so too of the things that we are made to endure, which God permits us to endure in this earthly life. They are not obstacles to be gotten over or under or around or behind. They are trials to be proceeded through, trials to be endured, so that by suffering them well, by suffering them in the Lord, they might be transfigured, transformed, and actually conduce to our perfection and God's praise in paradoxical and kind of mind-blowing fashion. Awesome. Okay, so with that, I think that's the beginning of an answer to why the Lord appears with his wounds. There are many more answers that could be given in turn, and this just scratches the surface, but That's the wonderful thing about speculative theology done in the context of the sacred scriptures and the church's tradition, is that it's an opening to contemplative insights which lie beyond the kind of present scope of our understanding. So cheers. Please do, if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel, push the bell so that way you get alerted when stuff happens. And please consider tuning into the podcast Godsplaining, to which I contribute with 4 other Dominican friars, which has sweet 30-minute episodes about all things Catholic, trying to kind of help you to cast a contemplative gaze on the daily comings and goings of human life. So my prayers are for you. Please pray for me, and I'll catch you next time on Pints with Aquinas.